So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about our project, SAIL, Supporting Autistic Adults' Intimate Lives. It's been funded by the NIHR to kind of look at this question of what is it that autistic people think needs to happen within health and social care so that they can be better supported around sex and relationships. So yeah, the funder has kind of the project has been funded to like directly inform practice. So a lot of this is quite practice based and kind of nowhere near as impressive and theoretical as the previous one. But yeah, I suppose as we kind of know, the autistic person is not a natural category, as Hacking would say, and instead it's come into existence as kind of a psychiatric diagnosis, and so it's kind of emerged from this discourse of deficit, as we all know. And the DSM and its forerunners have kind of produced the autistic subject as defined by, on the one, firstly, this kind of inability to relate, this inability to connect and to form relationships. And on the other, as a subject who is entirely kind of driven by restrictive, repetitive patterns of thought and behavior and sanctuary-seeking kind of behaviors. And these kind of two things sort of define a lot of how we kind of think about autistic people. And in psychology, of course, we're obsessed with autistic people in theory of mind and this idea that autistic people are unable to infer the minds of others. Still going on about this kind of deficits in empathy. And I think these discourses around autistic people as kind of unable to relate to others kind of feed into cultural tropes about the autistic person as the other. And like quite notably, this trope of the autistic person as alien or, so strange are their behaviors, so unable are they to relate that they're kind of otherworldly or kind of non-human or less human or alien and sometimes even monstrous. And these kind of diagnostic sort of tropes also feed directly into the kind of stigmatized and othering ways in which autistic people's sexuality is constructed, both historically, but I can also very much confirm contemporarily today as well. And there tends to be these kind of three things going on. The one is, of course, which again links to kind of ideas around the DSM, that the autistic person is like inherently disinterested in sex and relationships, potentially asexual, is completely like unable to relate or unable to do relationships properly. The other is this idea of the autistic person as kind of disordered and it kind of feeding into these repetitive compulsions as either hypersexual or disordered or fixated, like super interested in fetishes. And then there's also another kind of dichotomy of the autistic person as either the perpetrator or the victim of sexual violence. And all three of those things are kind of happening and they all work together to kind of, again, towards the kind of othering and dehumanizing and infantilizing of autistic people as they then kind of navigate sex and relationships in what is a heteronormative and neuronormative society with the kind of all the indirect ways in which we kind of generally do sex and relationships. So, given kind of the way in which autistic people have been othered and also the kind of stigma and exclusion that autistic people experience in relation to their sexuality, it makes sense that queer theory would be a kind of useful and productive lens for exploring participants' narratives. So Kristen Clears kind of defines queer as a traveling concept, but kind of at the heart of all of that, queer denotes a disposition to challenge normativity. And that's kind of like what all of my participants have done arrived at the interviews to do. I've been drawing on Judith Butler and Sarah Ahmed's Judith Butler's ideas of performativity and a lot on Sarah Ahmed's ideas of orientation, which of course there's so much to say about, but I suppose probably most importantly is this concept of failure, which is kind of a big part of queer theory. Butler argues that people will fail to live up to idealized versions of compulsory heterosexuality as they are radically uninhabitable and unachievable subject positions. However, it's through these failures, by performing bad or faulty versions of kind of normative gender and sexual identities, that norms can be subverted or queered, opening up new possibilities for resistance and change. So queer theory really just extends a kind of queer theory's critiques of heteronormativity to critiques of neuronormativity and kind of neuronormative ideas of behaving and communicating and thinking and relating in the world. As Barnett argues, neuroqueer articulates the queer nature of neurodivergence. It's pretty simple, really. So autistic people's, like from this perspective, autistic people's failures to perform kind of like these neuronormative scripts, if you're thinking about dating and relationships and communication in general, or behaving outside of the norm because of their neurodivergence, is understood as a form of queering or resisting normativity. Neuroqueer theory allows us to kind of examine how, certainly for me in this paper, neuronormativity and normativity and heteronormativity are kind of entangled, and how they kind of operate in concert with one another to kind of produce and naturalize the heteronormative and neuronormative subject positions for autistic people, and kind of force them into them. I think this paper I'm hoping, can show how autistic people's kind of failures to reproduce these heteronormative scripts can also open up new possibilities for doing sex and relationships in more kind of safe and pleasurable and neuroaffirmative ways. As I said, with the main aim being to kind of really inform adult social care, how they can do things a bit better. So this project is part of a much bigger study where we've done lots of things. Today I'm talking about some of the data from the focus groups. So we did kind of forum-style focus groups on a platform called Discourse. We had 5 different groups, 10 people each, and essentially you kind of onboard them. They sign up anonymously with their own aliases. You can see who they are, like as the researcher, but to each other, they're completely anonymous. And the groups are closed. And so for 6 weeks, we got these groups of autistic people to kind of thrash out and to really discuss between them, like about their lives, about their intimate lives, as well as what they wanted from adult social care. So I have a lot to say about this research method and the ways in which it is really neuroaffirmative and kind of allows people to kind of process information in their own time and participate on their own terms. But I haven't left space to talk about that today. Again, just very quickly, a little snapshot of who our participants were. There's 46 of them. So 61% of participants identified as something other outside of cisgender heterosexuality in one way or another. And 46% of our participants were also Black or from some other marginalized, kind of minoritized background and weren't white, essentially. We didn't, all of the kind of gender categories, everything here, participants kind of gave themselves. And you can see there's quite a lot of nice, rich variation in how they define themselves. There were 5 different groups. People could choose which group they went into completely just based on how they identified. To say this, the paper around this has just recently been published, which is very nice. So across all 5 of the focus groups, there was really a broad consensus that autistic people are more likely to be queer, or to kind of not identify or feel like kind of cisgender heterosexuality kind of really sums up their experience. And this, of course, chimes with previous research, which also shows that autistic people are more likely to identify within LGBTQ plus kind of identities. And of course, if you looked at our participants, 61% of them were queer. So within the focus groups, there was a lot of quite lively discussion. It was really interesting to see around like why this might be. And it was quite a joy to watch kind of autistic people kind of create these kind of understandings for themselves according to what they kind of thought, I suppose. And so what quite a few people came to was this idea that the reason that there's more queer autistic people out there is kind of articulated kind of at this intersection of cognitive differences related to being autistic and kind of broader experiences of being other or socially queer in a kind of neuronormative and heteronormative society. So one participant says, I describe myself as heterosexual for ease, and because a label doesn't really make a difference to me, it doesn't affect who I am. Even though from about the age of 8, I've always thought the idea that you would be attracted to a specific gender rather than a person quite unlikely and bizarre. In practice, I'm probably pansexual. I think autistic people are more likely to identify with other sexual identities because we're used to being outside of the typical, and because we see nuances, detail, and meaning behind these terms. So you can kind of see here how she's kind of thinking about, I'm socially queer, and autistic people are kind of used to kind of being kind of queer in other aspects of their lives. So taking that subject position or identifying in that way is maybe, not unfamiliar to them. But there was also quite a lot of kind of talk around, as you can see here, like the autistic thinking, kind of picking up on nuances and detail and just being generally more critical, and kind of like calling out inconsistencies when things don't actually make sense, which, like, to be fair, most of heterosexuality doesn't 100% really make that much sense. So in this sense, I think participants were kind of articulating that, like, their neuroqueerness really set them up to be more likely to identify and kind of relate with all these other identities. So again, the main conversation was really about what kind of support autistic people wanted and how they wanted to be supported. And I suppose the main theme is really this theme around resisting normativity. And I think that given how that historically interventions and support for autistic people have always been about trying to push them closer to the norm, thinking about ABA and all of those kind of approaches, and, which were kind of, to make them indistinguishable from their non-autistic peers. So this was, over and over again, a resistance against this. And participants wanted support that wasn't about kind of supporting them to better approximate heteronormative and neuronormative conventions, when that didn't align with their needs, of course. So I think, one participant says, any support that defines normal sex and relationships is too prescriptive, away, and should be avoided. As we've discussed in other threads, it does seem like autistic folk are more likely to not conform to cis monogamous relationship standards. And I think any support needs to be open and accepting of other forms of relationships. In fact, I feel it should be openly talked about and discuss subjects like polyamory, BDSM, and asexual and aromantic relationships, so that those who prefer those have the option to do so and safely and happily. And then she goes on to say, I think that if I had known that polyamory was a thing when I was younger, I would have chosen that form of relationship, chose to form relationships in that way. But I was never taught this was an option or how to navigate these relationships. A lot of participants' narratives were around these kind of failed orientations or kind of failing, trying to kind of approximate these kind of heterosexual ways of being and heteronormative ways of being and kind of failing. And I think most importantly, really, not knowing that there were other subject positions available for them, especially older autistic people who didn't maybe have access to the internet when they were younger, kind of lacked more kind of social networks, and just in general, autistic people tend to be desexualized, so no one really talks to you about these things. So one person said, I struggled in my early 20s when I first tried to date in a neurotypical way and follow conventions. I did not know that there was more than one way of doing it. And I think that it's important that autistic people have as much information as possible about these approaches. And so I think here, these stories are about struggling and about failing and about looking back at potentially missed opportunities. But they also talk, if we're thinking again about practice, which I'm always trying to do, is the transformative possibilities of actually giving people proper good support and education, and how that could, or at least these people feel in these quotes, could have kind of queered their path in positive ways. And then so far, we've spoken about queer autistic people's needs, but people also spoke about queer ways of doing sex and relationships, regardless of sexual orientation. And so, the ideal heterosexual relationship, as we kind of know, is expected to progress in a straight line from dating to exclusivity to cohabitation to marriage to having children to kind of a lifelong monogamy. And each step is understood to be both kind of leading to and also signaling kind of a deeper level of commitment and dependence. And these things are value markers of like a successful, valued relationship. And also in like adult social care, that's how people judge whether someone's relationship is legitimate or not. And some participants refer to this as the relationship escalator, which they criticized quite a lot. And just like our participants, queer theorists have been critiquing these kind of normative temporalities that construct this linear progression of relationships over time as being kind of both natural and universally desirable. And of course, feminist scholars have long been challenging kind of these values of complete dependence. And indeed, thank you. These expectations that relationships will progress like down these well-trodden paths defined by cohabitation and co-sleeping and codependence were unrealistic and uninhabitable arrangements for many of the participants. But for others, it was also just simply didn't suit the rhythms of their daily routines, their sleeping patterns, their work schedules, or their hobbies. So one participant said, I tried sharing a home with a partner in the past, and it did not work for me. I prefer being in control of my own home environment and having a flexible schedule. I also prefer being by myself when I'm not feeling well, particularly when I'm not feeling well mentally. And Vero said, thinking about what life would look like, I hate sharing a bed to sleep in, but not many people are up for considering living separately or in separate rooms. I like my space. I like my independence, although I need social care support daily to facilitate that. I do worry about growing old alone, though. So I guess in kind of contrast to these narratives of complete dependence, these two participants talk about valuing their independence and their own physical space. And like these two participants, many participants said that living with a partner or sharing a bed every night was not conducive to meeting their sensory needs or their emotional or physical needs, or clashed perhaps with their support needs, and also just didn't allow them the flexibility to maybe manage fluctuating physical or mental health needs, chronic conditions, and those kind of things. And I think these narratives sort of highlight how heteronormativity is so deeply entangled with both neuronormativity and also ableism. And like you can see in these instances, being neurotypical and able-bodied brings one to closer proximity to these idealized ways of doing kind of heterosexuality. You can live together, you can share beds together. While being neurodivergent or disabled may mean that one is kind of less able or perhaps less willing to approximate these heteronormative ideals. So we can kind of see how heteronormativity is always already neuronormativity. So some participants really kind of saw this dissonance between this kind of relationship escalator that you're supposed to do and their own needs, and the kind of like dissonance between that as a real barrier to intimacy. And kind of a lot of people said, I don't think I can ever have a relationship. This is not something that's open to me. It's not something that's for me. And you could see in the previous quote where the participant sort of said she worries about growing old alone. And of course, this does reflect the potential exclusion and isolation and alienation that a lot of autistic people experience. But other participants rejected this assumption that there was only one linear kind of legitimate pathway to relationships that you had to follow across like this passage of time. And they offered other ways of doing relationships that prioritize comfort and safety and pleasure. And importantly, participants wanted other autistic people to know that they weren't limited to these like one ways of doing relationships, and that they could do things differently if they wanted. Loads of participants said things like, I don't have any plans to move in together. People offered things like, living apart together, solo polyamory. Indigo Region says, I manage better with intimacy when there are spare rooms to hop into. There are times when everyone is uncomfortable in their bodies with fatigue, worries, medical conditions, allergies. Then we get to the issues of sleeping surfaces, duvets, pillows, air temperature, windows open and shut. I find there's more excitement created if there's less expectation of sharing the same bed every night. Which I think just also talks to the potential for pleasure and excitement around doing things differently. So I think these narratives really do resist and queer these heteronormative, neuronormative, and ableist expectations of the relationship elevator or escalator, which is a word that my participants taught me, and of complete dependence and of co-living as kind of defining features of what a legitimate relationship is. And they also offer counter-narratives that allow for people's own rhythms and their own temporalities, and allow for them to value their independence rather than framing that as a deficit. They celebrate neuroaffirmative, alternative ways of doing relationships, which queer these normative and often unrealistic and uninhabitable expectations, offering more expansive relationship structures and modalities of intimacy care, both kind of within and beyond the bounds of monogamous heterosexual relationships. I think thank you. This isn't just about being queer. It's also about queering our relationships, regardless of our identities. And I think they just highlight the possibilities for increased pleasure, incitement, and sensory joy that doing, and of course, being supported to do relationships differently might bring. That's it.
Wow.